Chapter 921 Elite Exchange. Xietain turned his right hand and under Angelo's and the two members of his elite team's surprised eyes made a small vial of slightly gray-colored liquid appear. Hey, Xietain. Dylan rubbed his hands together as he looked at Xietan's seemingly magical hand and asked, under his breath, could it be that you have a spatial storage object? That's right. Xietain nodded slightly without hiding the truth but without revealing too much. Man, you sure are lucky. Dylan shook his head and leaned back on the couch while looking at him jealously. We have been trying to find a space storage treasure, but all we have managed to obtain so far is a large leather bag that reduces the weight of whatever is stored inside by 99% and can hold a refrigerator as the items are greatly reduced in size. That bag is already an epic-grade treasure, for God's sake. The spatial storage ring was a legend-grade treasure that was comparable to Lilith's, a sixth-order higher existence. Actually, the fact that Xietain had acquired such a godly treasure was solely and exclusively due to the Destroyer's mission he obtained from the Soul Record when he and Shangguan Bing Shui counter-invaded Oblong World. It was only because Xietain slaughtered approximately 1 billion Asuras, among which there were 2/3 Order Soul Evolvers, and even managed to wound the Emperor of the Asura race while he was only a First Order Soul Evolver, that the Soul Record transformed all those achievements and records into the storage ring he was using. Otherwise, Xietain would probably still be wearing leather bags like everyone else. In fact, in Eventide World, only King Philip D. Gales possessed a storage ring, but it was of epic grade, not legend. Of course, there could be more, but Xietain didn't know everyone. So, Angelo. Xietain shook the small vial in his hand and said with a slight smile, I am willing to exchange the formula of this vial and the vial itself for you to study in your country's laboratories in exchange for the formula of the Berserker Serum L and a vial for us to study here in China. You're kidding, aren't you? Angelo forced a smile and shook his head. He scratched his head a little uncomfortably and said calmly, Xietain, we are also able to make our own potions and vials to recover stamina faster, increase healing speed, etc. We have even found formulas to make potions of intermediate quality in the ruin we took possession of before. Xietain chuckled and tossed the vial towards Angelo. I think you'll change your mind after having taken a look at it. Angelo caught the vial calmly and after looking curiously at Xietain wished to see the records of the object in his hands. Iron Skin Vial, Rank 2. Drinking this vial causes the skin to take on a dark gray color for 30 minutes. Rank 1 Forged weapons will have difficulty penetrating defenses. Medium caliber bullets will not be able to pierce defenses, and it hinders scratches from infected claws by 50%. Angelo's pupils trembled slightly as he looked at the small vial in his hand. Seeing their leader act like this, Eleonora couldn't help but focus in his mind. It was then that she understood what was going on, and if it wasn't for the fact that she was already used to it, her expression would have broken and revealed that she knew something without even touching the vial. Angelo passed the vial to Dylan and looked at Xietain with a serious expression. After a moment of silence, he questioned in a deep voice, this Iron Skin Vial is Rank 2. Potions or vials above Rank 1 can be made since our world has evolved 2 times, but finding the necessary materials will definitely be a probably bigger headache than finding what is needed to make 50 Berserker Serum L, and the duration is also less than that of the serum. Besides, what about the adverse effects? Xietain shook his head and calmly replied, although that vial is Rank 2, in reality there is only one component that is a bit of a problem to find. However, this difficulty only applies to lone soul evolvers or small-sized factions. Even a medium-sized faction could do it as long as they had a lab with the necessary tools, not to mention a large-sized faction like yours. Seeing that Angelo continued in silence, Xietain continued. The Iron Skin Vial has no side effects at all, unlike the Berserker Serum L, with the only exception being the fact that it can only be consumed by soul evolvers. In fact, a level 5 soul evolver can drink up to 3 vials in a row without any problem. So while it is true that the duration of a single vial is shorter than that of Berserker Serum L, its overall duration is higher as long as the consumer has more than one vial in their possession. Hearing Baizemen's words, Angelo fell into deep contemplation. If what Baizemen said was true, then the iron skin vial was something Angelo did not want to separate of. All factions in the world had their own problems. In the case of the United States of America, the biggest problem was the stupidly high number of zombies. After clearing Beijing almost completely of the most dangerous zombies, Baizemen's faction would have no problem taking over the other cities, districts, sub-districts, towns, and prefectures. However, things were different in the United States, because while the overall population was lower, the reality was that their cities were more densely populated in comparison, making it much more problematic to recover each lost territory from the hands of the zombies. With the iron skin vial, the casualties of the American troops would drop by at least half, not to mention that it also served to protect against range 1 weapons and provided armor against medium-caliber bullets. The other races were not the only enemies of the humans were also enemies among themselves. After about a minute or two of deep consideration, Angelo nodded as he looked at Baizemen with a serious expression on his face. All right, I'm willing to exchange a shot of Berserker Serum L and its formula in exchange for the iron skin vial and its formula. All right. Baizemen nodded with no change in his expression. The iron skin vial he was trading with Angelo was rank 2, but Baizemen had a few vials of the same type that were at rank 3 in his storage ring, as well as the formula to make them. Although finding the materials would definitely be a challenge, he had no plans to share the rank 3 iron skin vial or its formula with any other faction. In fact, Baizemen did not plan to share anything above rank 2 with anyone and would treat anything at rank 3 or higher as a national secret that only a very limited number of people could access. This was because the difference between rank 2 and rank 3 was simply too huge, and in a battle that difference would show from minute 1. Angelo was holding back, but so was Baizemen. Neither wanted to give their trump cards to the other at the same level, but they had no problem sharing trump cards of a lower level than the ones they had. Baizemen and Angelo continued chatting for about 20 more minutes, a time during which Chin-He, Dylan, and Eleonora listened attentively and seriously. After all, this was a meeting that could literally make a worldwide difference in the war between humans and other races. I wish I had more time, but I'm afraid I have to return to the United States. Angelo stood up, and while he reached out his right hand to squeeze Baizemen's, he couldn't help but sigh. What a waste. If only we had started this meeting yesterday, we could have ironed out so many more details and favored each other so much more. Baizemen couldn't help but agree and nod. Indeed, it's a pity. He and Angelo had only exchanged 2 things with each other. One was the Berserker Serum L for the iron skin vial as well as the formula to concoct them. The other thing that the 2 leaders of their respective factions had exchanged was much more important. Angelo had given Baizemen a digital copy of a blueprint detailing how to build an energy shield system capable of resisting vacuum bomb-level blasts or second-order Soul Evolver's attacks. This shield was a weakened version of the shields that the U.S. Artemis-class helicopters possessed and could be mounted on land or air vehicles. In return, Baizemen gave him a digitized copy of how to build electromagnetic guns. These weapons worked by consuming energy from soul stones, and with them even an ordinary human could kill a first-order Soul Evolver if they managed to hit the head or heart. However, due to a matter of mutual prejudice, Baizemen and Angelo made a few more adjustments. On the airstrip of the military base, Baizemen looked at Chin-He with a deep expression and asked in a low voice, "Are you sure you want to do this? It doesn't need to be you, and you know it." "I was planning to send Xiao Ming." Chin-He smiled bitterly and shook his head. "Xiao Ming is loyal without a doubt, but you know his head is not too good for these matters." Seeing Baizemen fall silent, Chin-He pointed out, "Besides, they are leaving behind a member of the elite. We can't just look bad in front of the other world powers, don't you think?" because neither Xietain nor Angelo trusted each other enough to be sure that the formula and construction blueprints they had exchanged with each other were real and unaltered. The two had to find a way to make sure the other wasn't trying to outsmart them. In the end, and after several proposals, both Xietain and Angelo decided that the safest way for both of them was for the other party to keep an important member of the other's faction as a sort of insurance. Of course, not to Xietan's surprise, the person Angelo was leaving behind was Eleonora. As for the reason, obviously, it was because the American faction leader wanted Eleonora to learn as many secrets from Xietain, his faction, and the core members of the Transcendent faction as possible. Xietain did not mind this, and in fact, he was grateful. He had his own plans and would slowly begin to implement them so that if everything went as he thought, Angelo would surely regret it for trying to play cunning. However, what surprised Xietain the most was Chen He as he offered to go with Angelo to the United States. Chen He looked at Xietain and patted his shoulder as he said with a complicated expression, "Actually, taking a month or two to be away from her will do me good. I need time to clear my head, and I think the distance might help. I don't know. After having feelings for so many years, it's not as easy as saying, hey, I'd better move on with my life, you know?" Xietain sighed in his heart as he patted Chen He's shoulder back in response. He didn't need to ask anything, it was too obvious who Chen He was talking about. Be careful in America, in a few months we'll be able to create our own serum if all goes well, and maybe you'll have managed to clear your head by then. Don't worry, Chen He chuckled and patted the bow on his back as he said confidently, although I'm not as strong as you, within the Third Order probably only 3 soul evolvers out of our entire faction have the ability to give me headaches. Xietain nodded, and before he could say more he heard Angelo's voice from the distance. Hey, ready to depart? I'll go now. Take care of my family, please. Chen He nodded towards Xietain and Xietain nodded in response to indicate him not to worry. After Chen He boarded the helicopter, Xietain approached Angelo and calmly said, Angelo, are you sure you don't want to exchange the technology of this helicopter for something else? Forget it. These Artemis-class helicopters are comparable to Third Order beasts in the sky. Angelo refused without hesitation. I see. Xietain didn't insist either, it was Angelo's loss anyway. What he had planned to exchange for the Artemis-class helicopter technology was the method of forming soul contracts with mutant beasts. Although in the long term the soul contract was better since unlike the helicopter, the beast would continue to get stronger over time, in the short term the Artemis-class helicopters were better since it was first necessary to find a powerful beast and defeat it before they could try to form a soul contract with it. A minute later, Xietain watched as the Artemis-class helicopter soared into the sky until it disappeared into the clouds. The sound of the rotors could be heard for a few seconds, becoming more and more distant until it finally disappeared completely. Xietain glanced sideways at the curvaceous small blonde who was looking at him with a grimace on her face and turned towards the exit. Eleonora snorted and followed him silently after a slight hesitation. Feeling the footsteps of the young American girl behind him, Xietan's eyes glistened slightly and a corner of his lips rose slightly. Lilith, who was following him closely, smiled when she saw this. Little brother, is it time to play? Don't tell me you plan to make the busty little blonde fall in love with you? If it weren't for the fact that they had company behind them, Xietain would have really slapped Lilith's butt. Chapter 922 Founder Leader, the one who decides the fate of all. After leaving the military base, Eleonora followed behind Xietain before asking in a bored tone of voice, Hey, could you at least tell me where we are going? Hearing Eleonora, Xietain moved forward 1 or 2 more steps before stopping. What's wrong? She asked when she noticed that after a few seconds he didn't say anything. Eleonora, I don't know how Angelo handles things in America, nor is it any of my business, so I won't ask about it. However, if we want this alliance of ours to work, then I think we'd better make a point clear from the start. Xietain turned slightly and looked at her with an indifferent expression that sent chills down the soul of the American soul evolver. I'll be honest with you, I don't know if the reason your team is clearly keeping their distance from you is because of your skill for reading minds or if it's because of how ugly your personality is. Eleanora's pupils trembled slightly and her face turned slightly pale when she heard Xietan's words. All thoughts of playing dumb or telling a lie disappeared when her dark blue eyes met those blood-red eyes that seemed to be piercing her very existence and revealing every one of her deepest secrets. Xietan's expression remained the same as did the tone of his voice while he slowly said, I know you don't like me, and to be honest, I don't like you at all either. I also know that the reason Angelo left you here even though I could kill you if your mind-reading skill is discovered is because he wants you to gather information for him. I don't care if for Angelo his subordinates are replaceable and I don't care if you want to be his puppet, but I want you to listen very well to what I'm going to tell you now. Here, in China, I am the king. I won't ask you to fight for us, but I definitely won't tolerate you putting the lives of my people in danger, because of your stupid arrogance and pride that I don't know where you get it from. Eleanora's face grew even paler as she heard Xietan's words, and finally a glint of fear containing something else shone in her eyes as she stared at him. It's not a threat by any means, I don't like threats. I am simply announcing to you how things are and warning you about the consequences, Xietain said before resuming his steps. If you want to stay all day locked in the room that will be provided for you, then good for me. If you want to sleep with 1,000 men a day, then good for me, as long as it is consensual. If you want to just rot, then go for it. But don't bother me. Different from Angelo, who can use his people as tools, I'd rather kill them to save us all headaches. Eleanora looked at Xietan's back almost until he disappeared before taking the first step, followed by the second and third, following him with her head down and deep in thought. Hee. Xietain, you really are evil. Lilith walked next to Xietain, and as she looked back to see what kind of expression the girl had, she couldn't help but chuckle to herself. That girl is probably having an existential problem right now. I wonder if she will break down or not. Xietan's expression was indifferent, and because he knew how powerful Eleanora was, he did not dare to whisper any words in reply to Lilith. Therefore, he simply continued on his way to the building where the meeting would be held in a few minutes. Actually, Xietain knew that Angelo was someone very important to Eleanora. This was obvious from how she looked up to him and practically idolized him. On the other hand, Eleanora was clearly being ostracized by the others, with perhaps the only exception being Dylan, but even he preferred to spend as little time as possible by her side. Who would want to be around someone capable of reading thoughts after all? Therefore, the fact that Angelo stayed next to her and didn't push her away but rather gave her respect and a position definitely increased his image in the girl's mind. At the end of the day, Angelo himself had said it an hour ago. He was trained from a young age to be a born leader and strategist. At the young age of 19, Eleanora was easy to manipulate. Xietan's eyes flashed slightly as he glanced over his shoulder without stopping his steps. Now, what will happen when that idol's image slowly begins to shatter? Xietain was curious as to what outcome his seemingly casual words might bring. Cruel? It was. At the end of the day, Xietain could tell that Angelo was definitely not the type to abandon his friends so casually, even if he was clearly using Eleanora. However, in war everything was fair game, and Xietain would sooner or later have to conquer America either by hook or by crook. If he could slowly implant the seed of doubt in Eleanora, then that would be great. It wasn't going to be that easy, but Xietain had time to play with her. The first bullet had been fired. Now that Eleanora would begin to question Angelo's actions, Xietain just had to go at his own pace to ensure no small likelihood that everything would go his way. Arriving at the building, Xietain walked straight in and seeing Eleanora following close behind, decided to let her go into the room to see how things worked under his rule. Hopefully, the number of apes will be few this time. Xietain sighed in his heart as he opened the double wooden door after reaching the top floor. It seemed to be that the stars often arrive last, because when Xietain looked inside the room he noticed that seated at a large table there were already more than 30 people gathered. He also noticed that there were empty seats, probably from the leaders who were either fighting in the north or were doing other important things that simply could not be left out. Bai Zemin walked to the main seat and the only sound inside the room was the sound of his footsteps. Before even looking at the others, Bai Zemin gave a slight nod towards Shangguan Bingshui, who was sitting to his right, and gave the same treatment to Wu Yijuan, who was sitting to his left. Wu Yijuan had a beautiful smile on her face when she nodded towards him, and to the disbelief of 90% of those present, Shangguan Bingshui smiled slightly towards him in response. Wu Yijuan was undoubtedly a very powerful soul evolver. However, what Bai Zemin valued most about her was her amazing management skills in any field. On the other hand, Shangguan Bingshui was a born leader capable of annihilating entire armies of soul evolvers by herself. The two of them were literally Bai Zemin's shield and sword. Bai Zemin nodded to the people he already knew from before, which made each of them subconsciously straighten their backs. However, something that made him frown slightly was that there were too many familiar people missing here. He looked at Shangguan Bingshui and calmly asked, "What about Luo Ning?" "I haven't seen her." Luo Ning had already turned 10 during Bai Zemin's time at Eventide World. The girl had most likely already become a great second-order soul evolver, so she should already have the rank of general in the army and also a rank 3 noble title, not only because of her strength, but also because of her seniority as a member and past record of accomplishments. However, Bai Zemin had not seen her anywhere. In fact, it was not only Luo Ning but even the Wen twins, the little pink dolphin, Xiao Xiao, Feng Tianwu, Feng Hong, Xiaya, etc. A lot of people that he had not seen even one time since he arrived. Luo Ning was mobilized to the west of China. She together with Feng Hong and Liang Jing are in charge of expanding our territory. There are some of our powers that are spread out in the peripheral bases to protect each establishment, but most of them were mobilized to the north. Even the Wen twins have evolved. I think you will be surprised when you see them. Shangguan Bingshui explained calmly. A/N, Liang Jing, old-looking assassin with a strange job who always coughs as if he is about to die. Feng Hong, Feng Tianwu's father. Wu Yijuan, who was sitting on the opposite side of Shangguan Bingshui, added with a mysterious smile. The one who will surprise you the most will probably be Xiao Xiao though. I see. Bai Zemin nodded, and for a moment he fell into deep contemplation. What kind of leader doesn't know what's going on with his own faction? Is this some sick joke? A slightly mocking voice sounded inside the room and everyone's eyes automatically moved to one of the people closest to the main seat. Bai Zemin also looked at this person but did not recognize him at all. However, he could tell that this person was a powerful third-order soul evolver. A handsome man with dark hair and ash-colored eyes looked at Shangguan Bingshui and said with a faint smile, "Leader Shangguan, is this person our founder leader?" How can such a thing be possible? He doesn't even know something as important as where our major powerhouses are located, and judging by the fact that you had to explain the distribution of forces to him means that he probably isn't even aware of how terrifying the situation in the north is. Shangguan Bingshui's expression turned as cold as ice and a flash of murderous intent shone in her sky-colored eyes. "Bingshui, who is this?" Bai Zemin asked calmly as he took his time to look at the other party staring at him, defiantly. A flash of shame shone in Shangguan Bingshui's eyes as she slowly said, "His name is Yifeng and he was formerly the leader of Hunan's biggest faction. He agreed to give up his power in exchange for a rank 3 noble title as well as keeping his position in the army, and because I was prioritizing a rapid expansion to conquer China as soon as possible, I simply accepted his proposal at that time." Bai Zemin nodded slightly and looked at Yifeng silently. He now understood the reason why this person he didn't even know occupied such a high position at this table. This Yifeng guy was sitting even higher than his father at this moment. "I'm sorry, It's okay, I understand." Bai Zemin interrupted Shangguan Bingshui and said with a faint smile, "You were avoiding conflicts to the extent possible to get the country for me, weren't you?" "I understand." Shangguan Bingshui clenched her fists tightly and nodded silently. "Yifeng, right?" Bai Zemin did not wait for the other party to speak and indifferently stated, "You seem to doubt my title as the founder leader of our transcendent faction, so let me prove to you that I have the power to decide on anyone's fate whenever I feel like it and in any way I feel like it." Yifeng had not even opened his mouth when Bai Zemin announced out loud, "From today onwards your rank 3 title is out of effect and in its place you are granted the title of noble rank 5. Furthermore, whatever rank you have held in the army will also be downgraded and at the end of this meeting, you will join Luoning's troops. You will assist and obey her for the duration of our faction's capture of the rest of the country." For a few seconds, the room fell deathly silent before Yifeng began to burst out laughing. In fact, there were 3 other people who had expressions of contempt on their faces. "You want to revoke my titles? You want me to go obey the orders of a 10-year-old brat? Who the hell do you think you are?" Yifeng stood up and his aura slowly began to rise as the smile on his face receded. Bai Zemin's eyes flashed weirdly as he noticed Yifeng's eyes inadvertently moving towards Wu Yijuan. "I am the founder leader. As I said before, I am the one who has the final say. Who can bestow or take away at will," replied Bai Zemin calmly before adding, "If you are doing this to impress a woman then you better sit down, you look ridiculous." "Ridiculous?" Yifeng was so angry that he began to laugh. He was one of Wu Yijuan's pursuers. Yifeng had tried everything. He had been attentive, kind, caring, and had been courting Wu Yijuan for over a month, but during all that time the girl literally only said a total of 16 words to him, and all of those words had something to do with rejection. Yifeng was used to having whatever woman he felt like having whenever he felt like it. Since the beginning of the apocalypse it had been like that. However, Wu Yijuan was not only a powerful soul evolver, but her position was so high that if he were to touch her, even a finger, the number of third-order soul evolvers that would go for his head was enough to make him tremble in fear at the mere thought of it. Therefore, now that the reason why she had been rejecting him was in front of him, Yifeng could not hold back the urge to show off a little. However, what he did not expect was that Bai Zemin would be so bossy that he would immediately humiliate him in front of all the faction's top brass, among which was Wu Yijuan, whom he wanted to impress. "Let me show you how ridiculous I am," Yifeng muttered, and his body soon began to grow in size. The weaker mayors that were just normal humans, but with high positions thanks to their leadership abilities, turned pale with fear as they saw a myriad of scales start to grow on Yifeng's body. Some of them stood up and retreated to stand behind more powerful soul evolvers who could withstand some of the terrifying pressure that began to fill the room. Rumble. The building that was constructed of rank 1 stones capable of withstanding the explosion of dozens of grenades began to rumble more and more intensely. Only the people who knew Bai Zemin from before remained calm and looked at Yifeng indifferently. Suddenly, however, that rumbling stopped, and under everyone's confused eyes, Yifeng's mouth opened wide. However, there was no sound from him even though his entire body was trembling fiercely. "As the founder leader of the Transcendent faction, I deprive you of all your titles." Everyone turned to look at Bai Zemin, whose body was surrounded by a halo of golden light to the point where it was difficult to see his silhouette. However, those 2 blood-red eyes glowed so brightly that everyone felt chills running down their bone marrows. After exchanging 90% of his strength for magic, Bai Zemin activated blood manipulation and while looking at Yifeng indifferently declared, "As the founding leader of the Transcendent faction, I deprive you of your life." Bang! Eleonora's face turned white as a sheet when she saw the body of the third-order soul evolver exploding in a blood mist, and while everyone looked at Bai Zemin in shock, a single thought flashed through her head. This man is out of his mind. Chapter 923 Silent looks between 2 women. The sounds of drops of blood falling on the floor, staining the walls, splattering on the ceiling, and being sprayed on the faces of the people closest to Yifeng were the only sounds that could be heard for the first few seconds after Bai Zemin made him explode through the activation of blood manipulation. Except for high-level soul evolvers who could use the mana around them to protect themselves from this kind of situation, the other people were soon stained red and seemed to have forgotten to breathe. In fact, despite the paleness of their faces, there was not even one who dared to move a single hair for fear of being next. On the other hand, Shangguan Bing Shui, Wu Yijuan, Bai Dilan, Meng Qi, Xiao Ming, and all the other people who knew Bai Zemin looked at him in shock. They knew that Bai Zemin was powerful. There was no doubt about it, and no one doubted that he was still the most powerful person among those present, even if none of them had seen him in action for almost half a year after his disappearance. However, what they had just seen was on a completely different level than what they imagined or expected to witness. Bai Zemin looked at the faces of the three people who previously seemed to have intentions of mocking. His expression was ice-cold as he activated blood manipulation. When they felt the surrounding mana begin to move, the faces of these 3 second-order soul evolvers paled and automatically began to beg for mercy. Leader Bai, please forgive this little's ignorance. Leader Bai, Yi Feng and I were not close at all. Leader Bai, I was not mocking you but Yi Feng because of his ignorance. Slowly, the blood that had fallen on the bodies of the others began to move as if it had a life of its own, and just like the blood on the floor, ceiling, and on the walls, it began to drag and coalesce into a single point floating in the center of the table. In a matter of seconds, the room was so clean that were it not for Yi Feng's shredded clothes and the smell of warm blood still lingering in the surroundings, it would be hard to find any trace of what had just happened. Bai Zemin waved his hand and all the windows in the room slammed open, causing everyone to jump in fright. At the same time as the smell of blood began to be swept by the wind outside, Bai Zemin calmly said, You three, whatever noble rank you have held from now on will be rank 5 nobles, and at the end of this meeting you will join Luoning's troops and the others in the west. Any objections? No. No objection at all. Don't worry, we'll extend our Transcendent Faction's territory in no time. Young Miss Luo is only 10 years old, but who doesn't know about her ability? No problem at all. Objection? What a joke. Everyone had just witnessed Ji Feng, a terrifyingly powerful third-order soul evolver, explode just because Bai Zemin wanted him to explode. Shangguan Xinyue couldn't help but let out a chuckle when she saw her daughter sighing with a helpless expression, as if realizing her mistake and seeing everyone looking at her in surprise after hearing her chuckle. Shangguan Xinyue waved a hand as if it was no big deal and calmly said, Don't mind me. In fact, no one expected Bai Zemin to be this powerful, not even the people who had the most faith in him. Killing an unclassified soul evolver might not be a big deal. Killing a first-order soul evolver was considered an achievement. Killing a second-order soul evolver would practically put one on equal footing with the elites of the faction, and killing a third-order soul evolver would give one not only prestige but also statistics to compare to some of the most powerful. However, killing a third-order soul evolver was incredibly difficult as they were all established powerhouses. As powerhouses, it was naturally impossible for them not to have at least 1 or 2 skills to preserve their lives, so unless the other party was very lucky or risked their lives, it was simply impossible to kill a third-order powerhouse. As for killing a third-order soul evolver by just thinking about it and saying a couple of words, such a thing was simply impossible, a fantasy impossible to achieve even in the eyes of Shangguan Bing Shui, Shangguan Xinyue, and Evangeline, who were the 3 most powerful soul evolvers in the entire Transcendent Faction, along with Chen He and Feng Tianwu. Therefore, when they saw that Bai Zemin had become powerful enough to do such a thing, it was not only hard to believe but also made many people sigh, especially Shangguan Bing Shui, who had a small bitter smile on her beautiful face. There were no more inconveniences after Yi Feng's case. The meeting went on for almost 3 full hours because Bai Zemin made several adjustments to the titles and positions of many people whether they were present or not. Although losing prestige and privileges naturally left everyone unsatisfied, no one dared to say anything out loud after what happened to Yi Feng, whose body exploded as if someone had put a dozen bombs inside him. Furthermore, Bai Zemin made it clear that they would all regain their titles in no time if they proved to be loyal and capable, so it would be up to them to get the position they had before due to the faction's urges or even climb higher. Xietain knew that this was not the best move, but he did not mind any of this even if it left many people unhappy. He would not allow those who had followed him from the beginning and supported him when things were hard to have a lower position than people who joined recently. Of course, if the new ones surpassed the old ones with acts worthy of reward, then that was a different matter. Everyone has the same opportunities. I will not be stingy with rewards, but I will not be stingy with punishments either. I want you to keep that in mind. I, Xietain, am a very simple person that pays kindness with kindness and cruelty with cruelty. Whether you go far or end up being sacrificed by me will depend on yourself. With those words, he dismissed everyone present. It probably wouldn't be long before all the bases under the control of the Transcendent faction would tremble as the news that the true leader had returned spread along with his demonstration of power and dominance when he killed Xietain with a couple of words. A few minutes later, the number of people who remained inside the room was drastically reduced, leaving only those people whom Xietain trusted or who would definitely not try to harm him in order to avoid harming their loved ones. Of course, Eleonora was also expelled by Xietain and instructed to wait for him in one of the downstairs rooms. Shangguan Bing Shui, Shangguan Xingyue, Wu Yijun, Wu Keqian, Sun Ling, Evangeline, Kong Lan, Xiao Ming, Bai Dilan, and last but not least, Meng Qi. All 10 people looked at Xietain since he had been the one who had asked them to stay behind. Chen He left for the United States. What? Shangguan Bing Shui and Wu Yijun were the first to react to his words. What do you mean by Chen He left for the United States? Wu Yijun asked with wide eyes. Xietain noticed that it was not only Wu Yijun that was nervous, but Shangguan Bing Shui was the same as well. In fact, even Wu Keqian, Sun Ling, and Shangguan Xingyue, who had known Chen He since he was little, were somewhat nervous. Although Kong Lan was better, the girl had a serious expression on her face since no matter how one put it, the reality was that Chen He and she had been teammates and fought together on countless battlefields since the beginning of the apocalypse. Xietain explained his fair exchange alliance with Angelo and the reason why Chen He followed the American team, while Eleonora stayed behind. He added, actually, I had planned to send Xiaoming instead, but Chen He went ahead and offered himself as a volunteer. After saying this, Xietain looked at Shangguan Bing Shui for a few seconds before sighing without saying any more. However, this small gesture from him was enough for everyone to get a rough idea of what was happening. Shangguan Bing Shui simply nodded after a few seconds. I see. Well, I don't think it's necessary to worry too much. Xietain smiled slightly to lighten the atmosphere a bit and said calmly, Chen He might be stuck in the Second Order, but he is certainly more than capable of fighting most Third-Order soul evolvers below level 130. Besides, considering that Angelo left behind a key person from his faction, it won't be necessary to worry about him playing shady. Sun Ling's expression relaxed a little upon hearing Xietan's words and nodded in agreement. That's true. That boy Chen He is certainly talented and capable of coming out on top regardless of the circumstances. After a few minutes, Xietain took out a syringe containing the Berserker Serum L liquid along with the formula to concoct it. Yijun, I would like you to get this to the best laboratory our faction has at its disposal, Xietain said as he carefully pushed both objects towards her. Yijun? The ears of those present twitched and looked at Xietain with surprise. Even Wu Yijun looked at him with wide eyes before a beautiful smile of pure happiness bloomed on her face. Let me do it. She would make sure that both the serum and the formula reached their destination even if it cost her life. This was the first time Xietain had referred to her in such a familiar and close way. It had all been so sudden that Wu Yijun could practically see herself going to bed tonight with one of the happiest smiles of her entire life. Sun Ling smiled too, except that her smile looked extremely sexy despite being a smile of joy. Looks like someone finally started to open up a little bit more, just a little bit, she said before looking at her husband and saying, Keqian, what do you think? Wu Keqian looked at his wife with a wry smile and said under his breath, I think we better not push him too much in case we make this kid regret whatever's going on in his head. That's not good. Sun Ling covered her mouth and nodded before pretending she hadn't said anything. Ha 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 ha. Bai Deland laughed good-naturedly as he saw the black expression on his son's face. Brat, this morning you dared to fool around with your father? It seems that karma really exists and has come to you faster than expected. Bai Deland felt incredibly good in his heart. Laugh all you want, but let me see if in a few days you can still laugh like this. Bai Zemin secretly gritted his teeth as he looked at his father and vowed revenge. He quickly took out a small memory card and passed it to Wu Keqian while saying in a serious voice, Uncle Wu, I went to my workshop earlier and saw that the factories here are quite well developed. When you get home, take a look at what is inside this memory card and let me know if it is possible to develop these energy shields in this base or if anything is needed. I'll have someone arrange everything for you. Wu Keqian's expression became serious as he took the small semi-transparent card in his hands. Leave it to me. I'll take care of it. Bai Zemin rested his back on the back of his chair and said in a deep voice, as you all well know, I have just returned from another world. However, my time in Eventide world was extended longer than planned due to some circumstances. Bai Zemin gave a brief summary of the reason why he was away from home for so long even though he had the option to return the very moment he opened the portal. I have a device with information and details of a world that has been evolving for several thousand years in my hands. He explained calmly. Even though Eventide world was a world in its second stage, just like our Earth, its inhabitants had a lot of time to grow up unlike us, therefore, the technology and knowledge on this world is certainly greater than ours in all aspects. Actually, we have obtained a great quantity of information from the books we found in the ruins, including formulas of all kinds. Wu Yijuan interjected, taking advantage of Bai Zemin's pause. The problem is that even though our world is in the second stage of evolution, 90% of the plants and minerals detailed in those books could not be found even after months of searching. I'm afraid we will have to wait until the next evolution of the Earth at the very least. Shangguan Bing Shui looked at Wu Yijuan for a moment before looking at Bai Zemin and adding, I think if we use what we found in the books in the ruins along with what you bring, we might be able to find a middle ground. Maybe strengthen more what we already have or will be able to do. That is precisely what I was thinking. Bai Zemin nodded as he looked at Shangguan Bing Shui and said slowly, because so much has happened I haven't had time to look at the contents of the device, but after I take a look at it once Callie finishes modifying the language pendant I will hand it over for you to handle. Okay. Shangguan Bing Shui smiled slightly and nodded in satisfaction as she subconsciously looked at Wu Yijuan, also looking at her. Shangguan Xinyue and Sun Ling looked at each other. Both mothers saw the peculiar smile on each other's faces. As for Bai Zemin, somehow I feel like something is not right around here. Chapter 924, The Mightiest Under the Heavens and His Generals. Okay, that's all for now. Bai Zemin waved his hand and dismissed everyone. You can go take care of your business. In 3 days, I will head north and finish everything myself. Everyone exchanged glances and noticed the surprised looks on each other's faces. Bai Zemin himself would head north? In the eyes of most, it was wiser if he charged into the other areas and conquered most of China instead of focusing on a minor area, such as Inner Mongolia. Only Kong Lan, Shangguan Bing Shui, Wu Yijuan, and Evangeline among those present knew that what Bai Zemin wanted was not the North Territory. What he sought was vengeance. Paying back Zhongda's death was something that only doing it with his own hands could make Bai Zemin feel better. Maybe, and just maybe, this could help ease some of the guilt he felt. Leaving the government building, Bai Zemin walked to the privileged area of the base. He covered his body with a cloak that was meant to cover the glow in his eyes and surveyed the surroundings. His steps were slow and calm, but for some reason it seemed to be extremely difficult for him to take the next one. Eleonora followed closely behind him with a confused expression on her face. She simply could not understand this man any longer. A few hours ago, he had killed a third-order soul evolver who was a great power and possessed the power to turn the tide of a war just because he challenged him a little. Now, Xietain walked the streets of his base as if he were just another survivor in the crowd, poor, without a vehicle, and without fuel to maintain it. First he behaves domineering and proud, but now he turns into a humble and lonely person. Eleonora did not know who the real Xietain was. After several minutes of walking, she finally could not stand the silence even though the surroundings were extremely noisy. Where are we going now? Perhaps Eleonora herself had not noticed it, but her tone of voice was much tamer and soft compared to when she was talking to Xietain before. As to whether this was out of fear or curiosity towards who the real Xietain was between the two facets she had seen, neither she nor anyone else knew. I need to visit a person first. After I leave her house I will show you the place where you will be staying. Xietain replied without looking back or stopping his steps. Eleonora nodded and no longer asked questions, and since Xietain never took the initiative to talk to her, the two continued walking in silence for about 40 minutes. Looking at Xietain, who had stopped in front of the door of a good-looking two-story house and had not moved, even after almost 5 whole minutes, Eleonora could not help but focus and try to read his mind. However, what she found were the most chaotic thoughts she had ever encountered, making her frown hard at the uncomfortable feelings that suddenly flooded her. Finally, and after much hesitation, Xietain took a deep breath and stopped his wavering. After reaching out his hand and ringing the bell next to the door, he took a step back and removed his hood while looking straight ahead with a serious expression on his face. Approximately 20 seconds later, the door opened and a beautiful woman looked at Xietain with a surprised expression on her face. "My lord." Xietain looked at the beautiful woman in front of him and his lips curved upward slightly in a warm smile. "Qingming, it's been a while, but you've become more beautiful compared to the last time we have seen eye to eye." "Right." The person in front of Xietain was none other than Qingming, his housekeeper and the one who had taken care of practically all his daily needs. Because Xietain had spent most of his time at this base and was staying at his parents' house, Qingming was practically free to do whatever she wanted while still receiving her monthly pay. She just had to be available to move to any base, depending on Xietan's wishes, since without Xietain present, would mean he would need someone to take care of his meals, housekeeping, etc. Qingming's eyes filled with tears, and as she covered her mouth, she began to sob, "My lord. When you disappeared after the nuclear launch." Xietain stepped forward and gave a gentle hug to this woman who was practically a second mother to him. Qingming was only 35 years old, and thanks to the high-level mutant beast meat she ate on a daily basis, her appearance was no different from that of a 26 to 27-year-old beauty. However, Xietain and she were close enough to be more than just friends, but not touching the level of lovers. After a minute of silence, and while caressing the woman's head in his arms, Xietain asked quietly, "Qingming, Zhongda's mother. Is she at home?" Qingming nodded and moved a little back from him as she wiped tears from her eyes. "My lord, Mrs. Lan is in young Zhongda's room. I have been keeping her company all this time. Your mother Mrs. Yi, as well as Miss Shangguan's mother and Miss Wu Yijuan's mother occasionally come and keep Mrs. Lan company for 1 or 2 hours before leaving." "My mother?" Xietain was a little surprised as this was the first time he had heard about this. However, after some thought, he realized that there was nothing to be surprised about. Yilinger knew that Xietain and Zhongda were students from the same university and had come from the north together all the way here. It was natural for her to see them as friends and not as a leader and a subordinate. "Thank you for accompanying her, Qingming. I appreciate it very much, and I'm sure everyone does." Xietain bowed slightly, to which Qingming responded with a small smile at the same time as she shook her head, softly. He took a deep breath and entered the house, before looking at Eleonora and ordering in a serious voice, "You wait here. It won't take long." Eleonora just nodded and stayed on her feet as she watched Xietain walk up the stairs and disappear after turning the corner. In the past, Qin Ming was a successful businesswoman before falling into the hands of Lei Su of the Four Big Boss Camp, so she had a great grasp on English. It was no problem for her to offer Eleonora a seat. Although Eleonora could tell that the woman in front of her was just a normal human, she did not dare to be bold after seeing Bai Zemin bowing before her. On the other hand, Bai Zemin walked through the small hallway of the house and stopped when he reached the fourth open door. From outside, he looked into the spacious room and saw a woman who looked to be 40 to 45 years old, with only a few gray hairs on her head, sitting on the edge of a queen-sized bed covered by perfectly white sheets. Even after a full minute, the woman continued to stare out the window with a serene expression on her face and, without noticing Bai Zemin's presence at all, as if afraid of scaring her, Bai Zemin simply waited silently at the door, ignoring the "it won't take long" he had said to Eleonora 2 minutes earlier. 5, 10, 15, the minutes passed one after another, and Lan Xiang seemed not to get bored of looking out the window, just as Bai Zemin seemed not to get tired of waiting standing. He had even closed his eyes to avoid scaring the woman in front of him. It was around that time when Lan Xiang finally seemed to notice a different presence near her. When she turned and saw Bai Zemin standing outside the room with his eyes closed, Lan Xiang's eyes flashed with a hint of surprise. "You are Bai Zemin, am I right? Zhongda's friend. I remember seeing you at the party 6 or 7 months ago. Come in. Don't just stand there. Oh, is something bad with your eyes?" She really spoke fast, and it was very difficult to notice any hint of sadness in her voice. Bai Zemin remained silent for a few seconds to clear his thoughts before saying in a soft voice, "Mrs. Lan, I will open my eyes now, but please don't panic. Due to a certain skill, the color of my eyes is currently red, but there is nothing bad going on with them." Lan Xiang smiled kindly and pointed out, "Child, I wonder if in this world there is something capable of making me scared." Bai Zemin stood without opening his eyes for a moment as he pondered Zhongda's mother's words. She was saying it because of the zombies and mutant beasts she had seen? Was she saying it because she had been starving in the past? Or was she saying it because of the loss of her son? These were questions that Bai Zemin did not have the courage to ask no matter what, and would live with the doubt for a lifetime. He slowly opened his eyes, and while he noticed a hint of surprise on the face of the woman still sitting on the bed while looking at him, Bai Zemin did not notice a trace of fear in her eyes. At the same time as Lan Xiang gestured for Bai Zemin to sit beside her, she began to speak in a soft voice. "This is my son's room. Actually, he should have the master bedroom, but he insisted on sleeping in this one." Bai Zemin sat down carefully as he took note of the fact that Lan Xiang spoke in the present tense when referring to the owner of the bedroom. He clenched his fists lightly, and just as he was about to speak, Zhongda's mother's voice interrupted him. "You came to say something to me?" Bai Zemin raised his head with a slightly surprised expression on his face. Lan Xiang raised her hand and extended her index finger as she gently touched Bai Zemin's frown. "You have several words written here. Sadness, worry, regret, shame, fear, and most of all, anger." Seeing Bai Zemin stay silent, she continued as she removed her hand and laughed softly. "This old woman is not an evolver. Soul evolver is what you call yourselves? Although I am not a soul evolver and only have some passive skills meant for defense that my son Zhongda gave me in the past, I have seen a lot of people in my life. It's not that hard to read a young man my son's age, no matter how indifferent your exterior is. Maybe you'll understand a little more when you get this old." Bai Zemin stood up as Lan Xiang looked at him, and under her gentle eyes, he directly bowed 90 degrees as he closed his eyes in sorrow. "I apologize and deeply regret what happened to Zhongda. This is all my fault, his death, the suffering you went through and still go through. This is all my fault. For that, I am sorry. I am sorry for my incompetence, but do not ask for your forgiveness." Bai Zemin's actions were more than enough to blow everyone's mind. Who was he? He was the man with the greatest chance of becoming the absolute king of the new China. A powerful soul evolver who, despite being only level 50, could crush third-order existences practically at will. the highest leader of millions and the hope of countless humans. Who was Lan Xiang? To most of the people, she was nobody. A weak human unworthy of mention who alone could do nothing but starve herself to death. However, she had another identity. She was Zhongda's mother, and this alone was more than enough for Bai Zemin to not feel at all uncomfortable or out of place while bowing as she was doing. After several seconds, Zhongda's mother's voice entered his ears as she calmly said, "You won't ask me to forgive you? I don't dare to." Bai Zemin shook his head and maintained his posture as he said in a hoarse voice, "I don't deserve to be forgiven. Zhongda followed me loyally, fought for me. But because of my past choices, I was unable to be by his side when those dogs." Bai Zemin's emotions got out of control, and as Lan Xiang looked down at his tightly clenched fists and listened to how the surrounding air exploded, she noticed that space itself seemed to weaken around his hands. Even the most naive person of all would have no trouble noticing the terrifying amount of anger he was holding back as the word dogs came out from between his teeth. Bai Zemin felt Lan Xiang stand up, but he kept his posture low until he felt two small hands on his shoulders. "You know, my son saw you as his icon. That kid usually doesn't talk much, but when it came to you his eyes would sparkle as he mentioned your feats and bravery." Bai Zemin slowly straightened his posture as he felt Zhongda's mother's weak hands push him up, and when he looked into her eyes he noticed that despite the tears hanging from her eyelashes she had a genuinely happy smile on her face. "A few days before he left for the battlefield he told me that his greatest wish was to one day be able to become one of your greatest generals." Bai Zemin listened to her words in silence as he gritted his teeth so hard that his gums split and began to bleed. The bitter taste of iron that flooded his mouth was nothing compared to how bitter his heart felt at this moment. "That kid told me that one day you would become the most powerful of all, not just in all of China or Earth. My Zhongda was sure that one day you would stand above everyone and become a true god that everyone would venerate." He wanted to be one of the generals of the future god. Seeing how Bai Zemin trembled as he clenched his fists and looked at her with a serious expression, Lan Xiang closed her eyes and the two tears she was holding back finally slid down her cheeks. "Back then I couldn't help but find it humorous. But right now my greatest wish is that my son's words will come true and one day you will become an almighty god." Lan Xiang smiled bitterly and said in a low voice, "That's the only way I can hope to see my child once again. Only an almighty god can perhaps bring the dead to life once more." Zhongda's mother knew that her thoughts were childish and if she said them out loud in front of anyone else she would definitely be ridiculed. However, what choice did she have? With nothing in this world, the only reason she continued to exist was because of the words of hope her son had left behind before he fell in battle. Even if those words sounded like a fantasy out of a fairy tale. Just at that moment, the most serious, firm, and confident voice Lan Xiang had ever heard in all her life rushed into her ears. "I will." She opened her eyes in surprise, and as she looked up slightly, she met Bai Zemin's eyes. Those red eyes that glowed like a demon's were terrifying and to anyone looking into them would represent despair. However, Lan Xiang couldn't help but feel that those eyes were filled with hope for her. Bai Zemin opened his mouth and said in a hoarse voice, "I know it sounds like a crazy thing, but I will definitely become the mightiest under the heavens. Even stronger than any legendary god or demon. And I will definitely bring Zhongda back. I will make sure of it. He is, was, and will be one of my generals." Zhongda's mother's mouth opened slightly and for a few seconds that seemed like forever. She stood silently staring into Bai Zemin's eyes as if to find a trace of falsehood in them. Finally, her lips curved slightly and her gentle voice rang out in the room. "In that case, I'll live on and will wait until that moment. Let me see with my eyes the kind of person the Bai Zemin, my proud son, came to admire so passionately is." Chapter 925 Spoils of War. Before leaving Zhongda's mother's house, Bai Zemin asked Qin Ming to keep her company in order not to let Lan Xiang feel lonely. To his surprise, however, Zhongda's mother made a request that Bai Zemin did not expect. You'll probably be moving all over the place while fighting zombies and mutant beasts, which means you won't be in this base for a long time. Since that's the case, the need for someone to keep a warm place for you to come back to and rest after a war is of utmost importance. If you don't mind, could I follow Qin Ming and assist her in her labors when it is time for you to move to a new base? When Bai Zemin was faced with this question coming from Zhongda's mother, he found himself in a great dilemma, as he did not want his friend's mother, someone that literally gave his life fighting for his cause, to work as a maid even if this was a dignified job and nothing to laugh at. However, what else could he do? Reject her? Bai Zemin didn't have the courage when faced with Lan Xiang's still slightly red eyes, therefore, he finally agreed. In that case, see you in 3 days, Aunt Lan. He nodded. 3 days? That's sooner than I thought. Lan Xiang was surprised. After a slight hesitation, Bai Zemin slowly explained, because I have been away from home for a long time, I would like to spend a few days with my family. 3 days later, my plans are to go to the north of China and suppress the opposition. Lan Xiang stared at him for several seconds before slowly closing her eyes. I understand. She sighed. How could she not understand that rather than going to crush the opposition, Bai Zemin's real goal was to take vengeance into his own hands? Don't worry, Aunt Lan. Bai Zemin assured her. The logistics team will be nowhere near the battlefield. You will not be in any danger, you can rest easy. Lan Xiang surprisingly smiled with no worries on her face and said with absolute tranquility, I am sure that even if I were in the middle of the battlefield, nothing bad would happen to me. Isn't that right? Bai Zemin looked at her with a serious expression, and after a couple of seconds, he said in a firm voice, That's true. Eleonora followed Bai Zemin's footsteps, and as she looked at his back, she couldn't help but feel that something about the person in front of her had changed. It was hard to pinpoint what it was, but as strange as it may seem, Eleonora could say that the anger in his heart had grown, and yet now he could control it a little more so that she could read a little more of his thoughts. The problem was that among Bai Zemin's thoughts, the predominant one that showed itself for Eleonora was one that, after surprising her and shocking her to the marrow of her bones, eventually made her unable to fight the frown that appeared on her beautiful youthful face. You have to be kidding, don't you? Hearing Eleonora's slightly serious voice, Bai Zemin looked over his shoulder at her as he continued his steps and calmly asked, What are you talking about? You really think you will become the most powerful in the universe and bring your dead friend back to life? That's a stupid and arrogant fantasy, Eleonora exclaimed, but seeing that Bai Zemin's expression didn't change, she added, That arrogant thought will cause many people close to you to die, and even those who have nothing to do with you will suffer due to the recklessness of your actions. If Bai Zemin was just another soul evolver of the bunch, then Eleonora couldn't care less. In fact, she would surely laugh when she got home and scoff at the other party's naive thoughts. However, the problem was precisely that Bai Zemin was not a normal soul evolver. He was a powerful soul evolver who with his hands controlled the lives of millions, and his every action or word could set countless ones to doom. That's a surprise. I didn't expect you to care about the good of others. Bai Zemin slowly looked straight ahead again. His footsteps never stopped, and after a moment of silence he added, As for whether it is impossible or not, you need not worry. If you survive until then, in a few years you'll be with your elite team hunting powerful enemies, and maybe, just maybe, you'll remember this conversation. You will get your answer then, but the you of that future and I will not interact like our current selves. Eleonora looked at his back in a daze, and her legs moved in automatic mode. She tried to process what he had just said, but even though the reason said impossible, the firmness and confidence Eleonora felt in the thoughts of the man only a year or two older who walked in front of her made her doubt for a moment about what was logical. In the end, she could only mutter under her breath, You're out of your mind. Maybe. Bai Zemin replied without looking back, and though Eleonora could not see it, his mouth curved upward slightly as he said indifferently, However, isn't the world we live in a world of madmen? We were dragged suddenly into a pot of boiling water. I think the craziest will be the one who will rule the world, and looking at where I am now, maybe I'm not so wrong? Strange as it seemed, these words somehow made the sole evolver of the United States of America lower her head, to stare at the ground as an expression of contemplation began to dawn on her face. Xietain left Eleonora in a nice house slightly away from all the noise within the privileged area of the base. Although it was not a super luxurious villa, the two-story house had all the luxuries of the highest level that a person might require in their daily life, and there were even 2 English-speaking maids at her disposal. He made it clear to her that she could walk freely throughout the base except for the forbidden areas, which were easily identifiable from a distance as there were always patrols of armed soldiers or signs with messages in Chinese, English, French, German, and Russian. You have been warned. Don't blame me if I'm rude to you for breaking the rules. Leaving those words behind, Xietain ignored the slightly grumpy expression on Eleonora's face and walked to the outside of the privileged area with leisurely steps. It was past 5 p.m., and although the current season of the year should be spring, the afternoon temperatures resembled that of a beautiful summer night, which was ironic considering that during the evenings the temperature dropped to the point where people hardly left their homes after sunset. Speaking of sunset, Xietain subconsciously closed his eyes and slowly took a deep breath when his favorite scent surrounded him. This is a beautiful sunset, don't you think? Lilith's soft mellow voice sounded from his right, and before Xietain answered her question, he felt his hand being taken by a relatively smaller and much softer one in comparison. He looked to his side and his eyes lightened slightly. You're right. This might be the most beautiful sunset I've ever seen in my life. He interleaved his fingers with those of the woman beside him, an action with which she happily cooperated. Of course. You're with me after all. Was it necessary to say those words? Miss Arrogant. But, I'm beautiful, aren't I? And even if we put that aside, you love me, don't you? Well, that's true. What thing is? That you love me? Or that I'm beautiful? That I love you. Does that mean I'm not beautiful? Humph. See if this big sister doesn't instruct you later a thing or two. 2 hooded people with long black cloaks covering their bodies moved through the crowd of survivors. The 2 held each other's hands while exchanging words that made people laugh and drew many smiles from the merchants and customers who, despite not being able to see the appearance of this funny couple, could certainly feel the affection they had for each other. When Xietain and Lilith arrived at the workshop, they both took off the cloaks that covered their faces. Xietain practically threw herself into Lilith's arms in one leap. Lilith mama. Lilith in her lily form hugged Xietain, and a beautiful smile appeared at the corner of her lips as her eyes flashed with tenderness. My precious Xietain. Did you miss your mom, Lilith? Xietain asked father yesterday, but he said Mom Lilith would visit later, so Xietain waited patiently. Has Xietain been a good girl? Xietain's eyes sparkled with hope as she lifted her little head to look at Lilith in search of praise. Of course. Lilith stroked the little girl's long silver hair in her embrace and said in a gentle voice, My precious daughter is a good girl. Your daddy's good girl, aren't you? Xietain almost fell to the ground when he heard the interaction between Lilith and Xietain. He pointed at Lilith and said in a loud voice, Hey, Succubus. Stop putting weird stuff in my daughter's head. Could it be that you have been thinking about something perverted and that's why you had such a strong reaction? Lilith smiled as she stroked the head of Xietain, who was looking at him with a confused expression on her small face. You. Xietain gritted his teeth and after a long time finally managed to calm down upon taking several deep breaths. You just wait. This senior will teach you what's good for you soon. Father, Mom Lilith has been a bad girl? Xietain asked as she tilted her head innocently to the side. Xietain, my precious Xietain, don't repeat everything your mama Lilith say, okay? Xietain rubbed the center of his forehead as he sighed those words. Why? Just don't, please? Little Xietain, your father is being unreasonable, don't you think? Father is being unreasonable, that's why. You just listen to me and you will definitely become a good girl when you grow up. Lilith, you. Only a few minutes passed, but by Xietain somehow felt like an eternity had gone by. He noticed that even the ever-obedient and cute Bai Sherlin seemed to be starting to fall for Lilith's engulfing words, and after realizing that the battle seemed to be over before it even began, he decided to obediently retreat. Seeing that Callie was still focused on her work, and since it was not even 7 p.m. yet, Bai Xietain looked for a seat in a corner. After sitting down and thinking about it for a moment, he decided it was a good time to catch up on his spoils of war, since he now had 1 to 2 hours in which to wait, before taking everyone home where his mother, Yi Linger, would prepare today's dinner. The first thing he pulled out was the scroll he recently obtained from the kill of the dragonkin that appeared in the United States. The skill scroll that Bai Xietain held was slightly different compared to most scrolls. Like the blood manipulation and gravity manipulation skill scrolls, this scroll was surrounded by runes, except that unlike the two aforementioned skill scrolls, these runes were silver in color instead of gold. Chapter 926 Restoration, Shadow Control, and Collector's Pocket World. With a single thought, the records that made up the skill scroll in his hands were immediately transmitted to Bai Xiein's eyes in the form of a message. Restoration, second order passive skill, level 5, increases the healing rate of all types of wounds by 50%, increasing by 100% for 20 minutes when healing type skills are cast on the user. When the user loses body parts, it can be restored over time. The restoration rate at which the body recovers depends on the degree of wounds and how high the user's health stat is. Bai Xiein's eyes glowed brightly and his grip on the scroll tightened as he reread the records repeatedly to avoid missing the slightest detail or overlooking any point of the detailed information. The mere fact of increasing the wound recovery rate by 50% was already insane, but the fact that that restoration rate increased to 100% when receiving heals and based on the user's body was simply outrageous. This meant that on the battlefield, Bai Xieinwould literally be twice as tough to kill compared to his current self. The current Bai Xieinwas already tremendously difficult to kill, but if he had this skill restoration in his arsenal, his enemies would undoubtedly experience the greatest of terrors, as the wounds they had managed to inflict on him with great difficulty healed at twice the normal speed right in front of their eyes. For example, with this skill, Bai Xieinwould not have been unconscious for 2 months after his battle against Demon Lord Argon, but would probably have been a month and a half or even a single month. And Zhongde might not have died. However, what thrilled Bai Xiein's heart the most was the fact that he could now recover lost body parts as long as he was given enough time. This meant that when Bai Xieinlearned the skill restoration, he would be able to regenerate fingers, hands, arms, legs, and even internal organs. The existence of the skill restoration would open countless doors for Bai Xieinin the future, and this was just the beginning. When he would upgrade the stage of this skill, Bai Xieinwas certain that in the future he would not necessarily be much worse than that dragonkin he had faced in the United States. Even if he didn't reach a level as terrifying as that beast, being able to regenerate limbs on the battlefield after receiving a fatal attack was enough to drive anyone into a frenzy. Bai Xieinhad already found the third skill that he would learn as soon as he had time and reached the second order along with the skills Drain Life and Dark Mist. After putting away the restoration skill scroll, Bai Xiein's extended his right hand and his storage ring glowed slightly, causing a new skill scroll to appear in his palm. This was the skill scroll he had obtained after killing Argon in the dungeon that was formed after the birth of a natural treasure when Eventide World evolved to its third stage. Looking at the scroll in his hands, Bai Xiein's frowned slightly when he noticed the silver runes. Although this was certainly a great skill, Bai Xiein's somehow felt that it was not the skill he thought it was going to be. Shadow Control, second order active skill, level 3. Shadows are part of the darkness born in the face of the existence of light. As long as there is light, there will be darkness, and as long as there is a body, there will be a shadow. Effect: consumes 50 mana points to activate and control the shadows for 30 seconds, being able to transform the shape of the shadows into a physical or magical object that will listen to the will of the user while the effect is active. Shadow control? The frown on Zemin's face deepened a bit as he looked at the skill records. He was disappointed, and Lilith probably noticed it from his expression as she approached him with Baisherlin, holding her hand as she asked in confusion, "Is something wrong? What is this shadow control thing you're talking about?" Lilith, take a look at this skill. Zemin passed the scroll to Lilith, and once she took it, he said with a frown, "That skill is the one I obtained from a part of the Demon Lord's records. Honestly, I thought I would get darkness manipulation." Lilith confirmed the records of the skill and her eyes glittered slightly. "Zemin, this shadow control skill is actually very good. Not only is it good for attacking, but you can also use it as a defense. The uses of this skill are only slightly lower than manipulation type skills and it is not below maker type skills." "No, I am aware of that." Zemin received the scroll and as he stared at it he couldn't help but sigh. "But, I really thought I was finally going to get my hands on darkness manipulation." Maker-type skills were terrifyingly powerful. Shangguan Bing Shui, whose main skill was Ice Maker, was living proof that soul evolvers with maker-like skills possessed the ability to become supreme existences. Shadow control was a skill that thanks to its diversity and surprise effect could stand on equal footing with maker-type skills. It was without a doubt a great skill. It was just that Zemin expected more. "Scoundrel, you think manipulation-type skills are easy to get?" Lilith shook her head. Lilith used to think that manipulation-type skills were just stronger skills than the rest, but thanks to Fire Sorrow she finally knew that these skills were on different scales than the rest. After a little hesitation, Lilith decided to tell Zemin a little about skills. "Zemin, manipulation-type skills are trap skills so to speak. These skills literally allow you to manipulate different types of universal laws. Even geniuses among geniuses can take tens of thousands of years and even hundreds of thousands of years to manipulate a law, but even then it will hardly come to compare to someone who possesses the manipulation skill of the same law." Lilith paused, and seeing that Zemin was looking at her waiting for her next words, she continued, I'm not quite sure about this, but I think I know who has the skill darkness manipulation." "Oh?" Zemin narrowed his eyes, and even though in his heart he believed he had the right answer, he still asked, "Who is it?" "It's Lucifer," Lilith said in a serious voice. "Lucifer? The Lord of the demonic army." Zemin lowered his head and muttered softly, "If that's the case, that might be a problem." Lilith frowned slightly with concern but said nothing. She knew that Zemin needed the skill darkness manipulation to take soul manipulation to the next order, and this was too important for him and his growth as well as for the possibility of restoring Zhongda's records. After Zemin killed everyone involved with his death and stored those records in his soul. "Maybe Lucifer is not the only one, no need to worry," she said in an attempt to lighten his mood a bit. However, Lilith didn't know that the reason behind Zemin's slightly heavy mood was not learning that Lucifer might possess the darkness manipulation skill. Although he preferred not to clash with the demonic army or its leader, for the sake of his future and the future of his loved ones Zemin would not hesitate to give his all to kill Lucifer if it would lead him to the skill darkness manipulation. "I feel something is wrong here." Zemin shook his head as he looked at the shadow control scroll with a deep frown, "But I can't tell where the problem is." Lilith also frowned as she looked at him acting like this. Her past self might have scoffed, but not her current self after seeing with her own eyes how terrifying the hidden sixth sense Zemin had was, an instinct even sharper than that of the beasts. Forget it. Zemin shook his head and put away the shadow control skill scroll. There's no use thinking about it now. He couldn't even find the answer to his incognita, let alone be able to solve the problem itself. Therefore, instead of wasting time, the best option was to become strong enough to crush whatever showed up in the future on representation of the discomfort he was feeling right now. Seeing how Zemin managed to shake off the thoughts that were weighing him down, Lilith couldn't help but let her eyes soften as she caressed his head just like an older sister. "You have grown a lot in this short time, Zemin." Zemin did not remove her hand but simply moved his head slightly upwards as his eyes looked up and said with A wry smile. What are these sudden words due to? She gently tapped his fringe and said with a chuckle, who was it that in an emotional fit destroyed his cell phone when the apocalypse began? Can you blame me for that? I don't know, you tell me. Xietain grimaced but did not pursue the matter further. It's time to see what this little guy can do, he muttered as he turned his hand over. Lilith's eyes glinted slightly as a flash of dull bronze-colored light shot outward from the central area of Xietan's chest. Lilith, what is the highest grade of treasure you have in your possession? He asked as he looked at the small antique-looking pocket watch in his palm. Legend grade, she answered honestly. Lilith continued, aside from my legend grade storage ring, I have 2 other legend grade treasures. Actually, legend grade treasures are very important even to us higher existences. A legend grade treasure grants too many stats, and some even have extremely powerful attached skills capable of saving our lives at the last second. Xietain looked inside his spatial storage ring. His eyes rested for a moment on the small deep blue elegant feather resting in a corner of the enclosed space as he nodded calmly, I see. He had not forgotten the legend-grade treasure he obtained after slaying the mighty Arctic asterisk no in the dungeon when the beast's tail detached. Xietain had plans for this treasure, and that was why the feather of the frozen end was still hidden from the entire world, as it was not yet time to reveal it. It was a pity to keep a treasure of such magnitude hidden, but there was a good cause for it, and Lilith's words had made him reaffirm his intention even more. Finally, Xietain touched the cover of the pocket watch and the records of the treasure were reflected in his retinas according to his will. Collector's pocket watch, demigod-grade treasure, a treasure as old as the universe itself. It is currently attached to Xietan's soul and cannot be stolen or taken by others through force. Since it is attached to the user's soul, it increases magic and mana stats by 1,000 natural points each. Attached skill number 1, Collector's Pocket World. A world where the laws work much like the universe, but where the law of time has been slowed down 100 times, compared to the outside world. The user can choose who enters and who doesn't, as well as what enters and what doesn't. Attached skill number 2? Sealed. Upgrade to God grade to unlock. Chapter 927, Collector's Pocket World. What? Xietain gasped in shock and automatically jumped to his feet as he looked at the bronze clock with eyes filled with disbelief. Seeing his reaction and noticing the shock Xietain felt, Lilith couldn't help but feel slightly surprised. Xietain was under the effect of the skill Blood Berserker's Wrath, with 2 triggers shot and almost 20% of his rationality consumed by anger and sadness, but yet here he was, literally jumping in shock. She subconsciously glanced at the bronze watch and her ruby eyes glittered slightly. She was also curious to know the records and power of a demigod-grade treasure, as this might be one of the few times in her life that she would come in contact with one. Xietain looked at her with a somewhat funny expression on his face and slowly extended his palm outward as he staggered. Lilith, why you, take a look at this. Lilith took the bronze-colored watch, and after looking at Xietain for a moment she looked at the treasure in her hands while narrowing her eyes at the records before her eyes. After about 5 seconds, and as Xietain looked at Lilith with a nervous expression on his face, he noticed how her pupils trembled slightly, followed by a soft gasp that slipped from her slightly open lips. This? Lilith looked up somewhat comically as she resembled a rusty robot. Her ruby-colored eyes trembled noticeably as she gazed with surprise into Xietan's blood-red eyes and said, with obvious shock, Xietain. This watch has a whole world inside it. And besides, the law of time runs faster inside by 10 times compared to outside. Lilith was so surprised, and the shock in her heart was so great that she couldn't help but ask Xietain something that she had just confirmed for herself. That seems to be the case. Xietain nodded and swallowed audibly as he gently took the watch back. Shirleen's small face moved innocently between Xietain and Lilith. Her black eyes sparkled with curiosity as the little girl could not understand why her father and third mother were behaving in such a peculiar manner. The little girl took a step forward and used her small hands to cling to one of Xietan's arms, and when she finally got the desired attention. Bai Sherlin looked at him with eyes filled with purity as she asked in a soft voice, "Father, can Sherlin hold that little watch too? That little watch?" Bai Zemin could feel the corner of his mouth tremble, and when he subconsciously looked at Lilith he noticed that she wasn't much better. Bai Zemin was sure that if it weren't for the fact that this little cutie was his daughter, an innocent little angel who despite her height and personal ability was actually only a few months old, he might have given her a smack to see if that would fix the brain. He coughed to clear his throat and dispel such vile thoughts as he used his free hand to pat Bai Sherlin's silky hair. "All right, my precious Sherlin. Father will let you have this amazing watch." Lilith was still so surprised that she inadvertently missed a good moment to say naughty words and tease Bai Zemin as she loved so much. Bai Sherlin's eyes sparkled as she picked up the bronze watch using her small hands and looked at it carefully for several seconds before a confused expression appeared on her face. She simply could not understand what was so amazing about this little gadget to make her incredibly amazing. Parents lose their composure. However, Bai Sherlin did not give up and continued to watch the clock more and more closely. Meanwhile, Bai Zemin and Lilith began to speculate regarding the power of the collector's pocket watch. If you think about it carefully, it's actually not that surprising, Bai Zemin said as he slowly sat back down. Lilith looked at him with a dead expression on her face and said in a serious voice, "Surnamed Bai, are you telling me that having a world that you can literally carry in your pocket everywhere you go isn't that amazing? Because if that's the case, then let me apologize for living a boring life. And no, that's not what I meant." Bai Zemin shook his head. He took a moment to take a deep breath and calm himself as he slowly said, "Lilith, do you remember the dungeon and the P***ns that were everywhere? How can I forget SN**RL**X and the rest? A priceless experience." Lilith nodded with a serious expression on her face. Bai Zemin continued with his theory. The dungeon actually had a dungeon inside it. The main dungeon was at least as big as a few Eventide worlds, or at very least comparable to the main world. On the other hand, the smaller dungeon wasn't explored, but it was certainly a world in itself. "So?" Lilith sat down next to him and looked at him puzzled. "So, what's the name of the watch skill?" Bai Zemin asked back. "Collector's Pocket World." Lilith muttered, and for every word she said, her eyes grew wider. "Looks like you noticed it too." Bai Zemin nodded with a serious expression on his face. "This has to be a joke." Lilith didn't know whether to laugh or cry as she stretched her hands out and said, in bewilderment, "You're telling me that Pocket World is meant for training P***ns? Well, not necessarily P***ns, but probably an army of soul evolvers or something." Bai Zemin stood up and said now more calmly, "We just have to see what the limits are and what can be done in this world that exists inside the bronze watch. My dear Sherlin." Bai Zemin's words stuck in his throat and his face went white as he turned around to look at Bai Sherlin, because when he planned to borrow the watch back from her he saw something that for a moment made him panic. Standing no more than 2 or 3 steps away from where Bai Zemin and Lilith were sitting and talking a second ago, Bai Sherlin stood with a frown on her face as she slowly pulled the bronze watch, now covered in saliva, from the inside of her mouth. Bai Sherlin looked at Bai Zemin with a pitiful expression on her little face as she growled under her breath, "Father, what's so amazing about this machine?" Sherlin has looked at it several times but found nothing amazing other than its endurance. Sherlin is so strong that she can even hit Uncle Kong Jun several times, but Sherlin can't break this little clock. It doesn't even taste good. Bai Zemin's mouth opened comically as his eyes followed the movement of the strings of transparent saliva that dangled and slowly fell to the ground. Sherlin. Bai Zemin looked at her and swallowed as he asked softly, "How did you manage to put that watch in your mouth? Is that a skill of yours?" Although the collector's pocket watch was just as its name indicated, a pocket watch, it was not something a person could put in their mouth just like that. Its size was certainly bigger than what Bai Zemin could open his mouth wide, so for him it was out of the question to even try. Skill? It's not. Bai Shirlin shook her head and said in an innocent voice, "See." Then, Bai Zemin finally remembered that although Bai Shirlin had human appearance, most of her records were from the former queen of the weaver ants, Shirlin. Bai Shirlin could open her mouth at will to a size capable of scaring small children and becoming a legend told at night to misbehaving kids by their parents. Seeing the beautiful, illusion-like face his daughter had, Bai Zemin thought that evolution was truly a wonderful thing. He coughed to clear his throat and carefully took the watch from Bai Shirlin's hands. It was all slimy and wet. Bai Zemin used the cloak he was wearing earlier to brush it off. It's a good thing that old man went to sleep, or else he might have had a heart attack. Bai Zemin couldn't help but laugh as he spoke his thoughts out loud. That old man? Lilith looked at him in confusion as she realized there was some information she didn't know. Zemin, what are you talking about? Oh, it turns out a lot had happened in the last time. After fighting Demon Lord Argon and killing him, Bai Zemin fell unconscious for 2 months, and when he woke up he learned about Zhongda's death, so he returned to Earth that same day, without even setting everything up the way he would have liked before he left Eventide World. Then, despite having returned to Earth, Bai Zemin found himself landing on American soil due to the special alteration of some technology under the power of the United States of America, and there he fought a dragonkin and met the leader of the most powerful faction in the country. Upon returning to China, Bai Zemin was catching up with his faction's current situation after being away from home for almost half a year. So much had happened that he literally had not had time to sit down with Lilith and have a good conversation. A few minutes later, Lilith looked at Bai Zemin with a complicated expression on her face as she slowly said, "Then, the reason why your aura underwent abrupt changes in a matter of fractions of a second as you stopped on the 9,999th step of the staircase to heaven, and the reason behind your strange behavior, as well as the drastic change your demeanor underwent, is all due to the fact that you lived in an illusion for 10,000 years. That's right." Bai Zemin nodded and a glint of uneasiness flashed in his eyes as he muttered under his breath, I know that the will of the collector's pocket watch sealed the memories of my life in that illusion for my own sake, to prevent my soul from being damaged and my personality from being altered abruptly. But I have this intense feeling of uneasiness every time I think about this matter. Somehow, I feel like I'm forgetting something. Or someone too important. It's a feeling I really hate. Lilith could feel Bai Zemin's discomfort, she could see it in his expression. Zemin, you just have to be a little more patient. You already figured out that you can break that seal by yourself, right? Just break it little by little, very carefully, while letting all those memories, lived experiences, and who knows what else get assimilated with your soul and true personality. She said in a gentle voice. Bai Zemin tried to force a smile as he said calmly, "It's all right, don't worry. It will all come together little by little and each piece of the puzzle will eventually fall into place." Lilith nodded with a slight but charming smile on her face that, despite looking very normal from a soul evolver's point of view, actually had the potential to attract men's eyes like bees attracted to honey. Very well. Bai Zemin's expression became serious, and as he looked at the bronze watch in his hand he used his thumb to press down on the button protruding from the top of the treasure. The bronze lid opened, and as a large amount of green letters reflected in Bai Zemin's eyes, he said in a deep voice, "Let us discover the true power this watch and the world holds within it. By activating the first attached skill of the collector's pocket watch, the user will be able to enter the collector's pocket world alone or accompanied. If the other existence is an intelligent being, then its consent is first needed before the user can bring them into the inner world. And if the other existence is a living being without intelligence, then said existence must be domesticated or tamed so that there is no ill will towards the owner of the collector's pocket watch. The owner can only enter or exit the collector's pocket watch during a relaxed or out-of-combat state. The records of the collector's pocket watch, or rather, the records of the watch's first skill flashed in Bai Zemin's eyes as he pressed the button at the top. Although there was a lot of information, in truth, Bai Zemin felt that it was quite vague. Would the timing of the skills continue to run normally within the inner world of the watch? For example, if Xietain used Blood Divine Punishment, whose cooldown was 7 days in the outside world, and entered the Collector's Pocket world, that time would continue to run, and in about 15 to 17 hours of the real world, the skill would become available again after 7 days had passed for him within the inner world. What kind of benefits were there in the inner world, or what kind of cons did it have? There were many things that needed to be tested carefully and slowly. Chapter 928 Broken Watch. With Lilith and Xietain beside him, Xietain paused, standing in the middle of a large clearing, and carefully surveyed the world around him. As far as the eye could see, all Xietain could see was grassland. The land was covered by a thin layer of light green grass. There were a few elevations here and there, but nothing close to being called a mountain or even a valley. The sky was as blue as the earth's, and the white clouds that seemed to hang in the air moved slowly in sync with the movement of the sparse number of trees there. Xietain tugged on Xietan's sleeve, and when the girl finally received his attention, she said in a gentle voice, "Father, Xietain feels heavy." Heavy? Xietain was surprised before he finally noticed what was happening. He looked at the surroundings and muttered under his breath, "The gravity of this place seems to be comparable to Eventide worlds, so it is at least 4 to 5 times more powerful than the current Earth's gravity." Because he had been in Eventide world for so many months, and thanks to his strong physical body, Xietain simply hadn't noticed the gravitational difference between Earth and the Collector's Pocket world. "Xietain, are you okay? Can you withstand this pressure?" he asked hurriedly. "It's fine, Father. It's just a little uncomfortable, but Xietain thinks she can adjust to it soon." Xietain replied after a brief consideration. "I see, that's great." Xietain patted the top of the girl's head and didn't forget to praise her. "My little Xietain is the best." Xietain was a level 87 soul evolver. Not only was she a second-order existence, but as a future queen of Weaver Ants, her physical body was terrifyingly durable and powerful, to the point where when it came to toughness her bones were comparable to Xietan's with the passive skill Golden Bones. This kind of gravity definitely cannot be handled by a human below level 20 unless they are fed with meat or other foods rich in mana and soul power, as is the case with the humans of Eventide world. Lilith commented as she took a few steps around the area. "If you were to bring a survivor of your faction to this place, their bones would turn to dust in a matter of seconds and their internal organs to pulp." Xietain nodded silently in agreement. After a brief pause, he suddenly activated Shadow Blink and appeared behind Xietain. "Father?" The girl looked at him in confusion with her big black eyes. Xietain simply smiled and stroked the little girl's hair, causing her to close her eyes and enjoy the warmth of his hand. Meanwhile, he paid attention to the rune engraved in his soul that represented the skill Shadow Blink. 10, 20, 30 seconds. The seconds passed one after another, and by the time 60 seconds had passed after he activated Shadow Blink, Xietain finally saw the opaque rune light up once again as an indicator that it was now available. It seems that the cooldown time of the skills doesn't change within this world. Xietain rubbed his chin as he muttered to himself, even though it was only 60 seconds in this world. Outside of the Collector's Pocket world, the time that really passed through were 600 seconds, 10 times more. "Lilith, I'll be right back," Xietain said, and without waiting for a reply from her he simply disappeared, without a trace, with such speed that even Lilith didn't see him. "Looks like space law is working well," she chuckled. Xietain reached over and took her hand as she asked softly, "Father?" "He'll be right back," Lilith replied, and not even a moment later noticed how space twisted. "Look. He is here." Xietan's body was only inside of the two for 6 seconds before he disappeared again. "He's gone," Xietain said as she stared at the place where her father had just disappeared. 2 seconds later, Xietain reappeared and she said with fun, "He's here." Lilith laughed softly at Xietan's tenderness before focusing on Xietain and asking with genuine curiosity, "How did it go? Did you find out anything?" Xietain looked at the Shadow Blink skill rune, and a hint of regret seeped into his voice as he slowly said, "What a pity. It seems that this world's time difference doesn't affect skills. Xietain had activated Shadow Blink in the outside world and had then immediately returned to the collector's pocket world. However, even though Xietain spent 6 seconds in the collector's pocket world and immediately returned to the outside world where 60 seconds had already passed, the skill Shadow Blink was still on cooldown as if he had just used the skill in the outside world even though 1 minute had actually passed in Earth time. Lilith couldn't help but feel that it was a pity, but at the same time she couldn't help but sigh in relief. Xietain, although it's indeed a pity, I think it's normal for the skills to be unaffected by the time difference between this world and the outside world. Besides, I think it's better this way. Better? He looked at her puzzled. Lilith, if the skills were affected, the cooldown time of my skills would charge 10 times faster whenever I entered the collector's pocket world. Well, that's true, but while that has advantages, there is also a big disadvantage that you are ignoring, Lilith pointed out. Oh? He frowned slightly and asked in confusion, what is that disadvantage you are talking about? Xietain, if your skills were affected by the time difference, then that would mean that your soul would also be getting affected. At the end of the day, skills are part of our souls. Lilith continued in a serious voice, this means that your soul would be aging 10 times faster than normal by spending time in this world, so your life expectancy would always be running out 10 times faster than normal in the eyes of others. What was it that allowed soul evolvers to evolve? It was soul power, the absorption of records or part of the souls of other living beings, and the subsequent strengthening of one's own soul, which in turn strengthened the body. If Xietain spent 500 years in the collector's pocket world, the time for all other living beings in the universe would have run only 50 years. However, if his soul was affected by the time difference, Xietain would emerge as a middle-aged man or even a man in his old age when he returned to Earth, while everyone else would still look young since only half a century would have passed for them. Xietan's eyes flashed with a hint of fear at this important fact that he had inadvertently overlooked. Lilith seemed to be able to notice what he was thinking, so she added with a slight smile, well, that's why every universal law is so powerful and hard to manipulate or even learn. Being the most lethal law of all, the law of time is terrifying to the point where no one can really manipulate it, and the most some higher existences can do is build areas where the flow of time moves slower or faster, but that's about it. Xietain nodded and was about to say something when his eyes suddenly lit up. Although the skill thing turned out to be a failure, that doesn't mean there aren't other ways to take advantage of this world to strengthen myself or my faction. Of course. Lilith chuckled and pointed at the surroundings as she said happily, Xietain, you have a whole world full of laws you can study. You can have your subordinates practice combat and become much more adept at using their skills or weapons. This is a treasure for which, for the sake of obtaining it, bloody wars between the most powerful factions in the universe would break out again and again. That's not all. Xietain smiled and while looking at the vast world around him remarked, Lilith, if I plant something in this place, every harvest will be 10 times more effective. Given enough time, the food problem will no longer be a problem. I can even bring the tigers we found in the Sky Destroyer to nurture them here so that they will grow 10 times faster compared to Earth. Xietan's eyes shone brightly, and the more he spoke and explored the seemingly endless opportunities this empty world held for him, the harder his heart thumped. Lilith was genuinely happy too. This was a treasure that was not only of use to Xietain, but even she would benefit from it, as in this world she could practice her skills, whether learned from skill scrolls or learned on her own. It should be another hour and a half before the clock strikes 9 p.m. in the outside world. So, Callie will stay immersed in her work until then. Xietain clapped his hands and said with a faint smile, that means I have about 15 hours of time. What will you do? Train with the whip? Lilith folded her arms and smiled in response. Nope. Xietain shook his head and looked at the surroundings as he calmly said, for better or worse, this world belongs to me and will probably be my home from now on. Therefore, I need to build a house where I can sleep, eat, rest, and hang out. I guess you're right. Lilith nodded as she realized that she had passed on this fact. Since this is a world of its own, I suppose it will also experience weather changes, so building a shelter isn't a bad idea. With the collector's pocket world, Xietain would no longer have sleep problems. He only needed to sleep comfortably here, so that even if he slept 10 hours it would only have been 1 hour on Earth. There was no need to waste such a valuable resource as was time. Xietain would make the most of the collector's pocket watch. Regarding the bronze watch, Xietain frowned as he looked at the demigod-grade treasure. He pressed the button at the top and the lid opened, revealing the inside. But unlike a clock or a space to put a photograph, as was usually the case with normal pocket watches, this watch had 12 empty holes where the numbers were supposed to be. The hands of the clock were broken, or rather, they were incomplete, since both the smallest and the largest were only half the original size, and currently both were pointing towards the empty hole where in traditional clocks the number 12 would be. I wonder if this has something to do with the second skill, currently sealed, of the collector's pocket watch. Xietain muttered as he stared at the bronze watch with a slight frown. The first skill was already this powerful. Xietain couldn't even imagine how strong the second skill was that could only be contained by the power of a god-grade treasure. Lilith approached him and looked at the inside of the watch out of pure curiosity as well. However, her expression changed slightly when she saw the 12 empty holes and broken hands. I'm sure I've seen something very similar, if not identical to this, before. Chapter 929 Teamwork, Father, Mother, and Daughter. The more Lilith looked at the 12 holes and the broken hands of the bronze clock, the more certain she became that somewhere she had seen something similar. Lilith stared at the clock with such intensity that it didn't take her long to discover that what she had seen at some point in her life was not an image just like the broken bronze clock, but something else, something that definitely had something related to the treasure in Xietan's hands. Lilith, is something wrong? She may have been deep in thought for longer than she thought, since when her beloved's voice brought her out of the trance Lilith had fallen into, she found herself met with Xietan's slightly worried expression as she raised her eyes to look at him. It's nothing, she shook her head and smiled refreshingly. I just felt that I had seen something similar to the bronze clock you hold, but it's probably just a confused thought of mine, don't pay it too much mind. Xietain stared at her for several seconds, and after realizing that she was being honest and there was nothing wrong happening, he smiled. I see. In that case, how about we get to work? Let's do it. Lilith nodded as she tried to push the doubt in her heart to the back of her mind. She couldn't even remember what it was that she had seen, let alone where anyway. What was the use of being left mindlessly thinking about something that Lilith knew she couldn't decipher, just because she wanted to? Just as Xietain said before, every piece of the puzzle will eventually fall into place if that's the way it was meant to be. Time was undoubtedly the most mysterious law of all and the most terrifying. Even those higher existences who had somehow managed to find a middle ground where the law of time did not corrode their bodies, souls, and minds were not immune. Countless practically immortal beings had committed suicide, and not many made it to the age of 100,000 years as proof that nothing was really eternal and that everything would eventually come to an end. Be that as it may, time could be terrifying or enjoyable depending on the perspective from which one stood and looked at it. Living alone for 1 century was certainly scary. However, it was really scary to live 1 century together with loved ones and doing all sorts of things together. In the collector's pocket world, 3 voices could be heard along with constant explosions forming a strangely not at all unpleasant melody in conjunction with the sound of fire burning and metal being reformed. Mother, is this tree okay? Xietain lifted a large tree over 200 meters long with one hand while looking at Lilith with sparkling eyes. That one is perfect. Can you take it to your father? Lilith said as she worked on the land and prepared it to be turned into a future farm. Thanks to this being a pocket world belonging to Xietain, Lilith was now far less restricted than before compared to Earth, Eventide world, or any lower world. Okay. Xietan's eyes flashed with excitement, and under Lilith's wry smile, the girl threw the giant tree through the air as if it were a spear as her melodious voice stretched into the distance. Father, here is the tree you were looking for. Boom. A great cloud of dust rose as the tree buried itself in the ground. Xietain wiped the dust from his face as he said, not knowing whether to laugh or cry, my dear Shirlin, thank you for your help. Hee, you're welcome. As Lilith worked on the earth, Shirlin turned into something similar to a lumberjack as under her powerful hands dozens of giant trees began to fall one after another. Boom. 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 Although this was not a battlefield, giant shadows were projected on the ground every time Shirlin threw a tree into the sky towards Xietain. As for Xietain, the first thing he did was to use the trees to shape the house, if one could call what he was building a house. Little scoundrel, I thought we were making a shelter? Of course, this will be our shelter. Nonsense, that will become a mansion if you keep this up. Little succubus, who said a shelter couldn't be big, beautiful, and full of luxuries? Father, Shirlin wants a pool. Shirlin, stop giving ideas to this little rascal. A swimming pool is in order. After building the outer outline of the 3-story house, Xietain began sketching in a sketchbook the design of the furniture he would use to adorn the interior. All this took him about 2 hours of time, and when he finished, he started to work on the elaboration of the furniture with the help of Lilith and Shirlin. Xietain cut the wood with a sword and threw the cut pieces to the side where Lilith with the help of Shirlin sanded them down. Because the house would be large, the number of pieces of furniture needed was also large. The number of beds alone amounted to more than 30, so one could only try to imagine how hard this task was. Especially since the furniture they were designing was not simply square or rectangular, but some of them had exotic shapes or elegant designs that needed to be carefully worked out and therefore required more time to make them ready. Xietain might be considered moderately good at blacksmithing, but while there was some common ground, woodworking was certainly not the same as hammering metal or cutting leather. Even after 10 hours, the furniture work still wasn't finished at all and little Shirlin couldn't take it anymore, so she directly fell asleep on the treasure bed that Xietain carried in his storage ring everywhere. About 30 minutes later, Xietain finally stopped his movements, and when he looked to his right he saw something that made him smile warmly. After entering the collector's pocket world, Lilith had regained her original appearance. At this moment, while she was using her delicate hands to hold a small skewer and painting what was the door of one of the cabinets of the house, her beautiful face was covered by a serious expression. Seeing her clearly focused on her task, Xietain could not stop a small giggle from escaping his mouth, and by the time he realized it was already too late. Attracted by the sound, Lilith looked at him puzzled and asked, with genuine confusion, "What are you laughing at?" A flash of regret shone in Xietan's eyes. He really wanted to look at that appearance of hers some more. Unfortunately, it seemed that for today that was all he would get. "Lilith, I love you." Lilith opened her eyes in surprise and a slight blush slowly rose on her cheeks. After a moment of silence, she asked softly, "To what does that do?" Xietain stood up and stretched his body somewhat stiffly as he calmly said, "Nothing special. I just wanted to express my feelings to you in words, so I said it." He looked at her and said with a raised eyebrow, "Problem?" Lilith shook her head. She sometimes really couldn't understand what the young man in front of her was thinking. Actually, Xietain felt a bit nostalgic and warm when he saw Lilith working hard for the sake of their home. Xietan's memories of seeing his mother and father working as a perfect team to improve even the slightest possible quality of life for their family and the place they lived in hit him hard. There was a time when Xietain thought he would be alone for life. Not only was he weary of women because of his past, but he was unwilling to settle for less than he thought he deserved, even if it meant living his life in solitude. He did not ask for beauty or wealth. All Xietain wanted was a woman who would stand by his side and with whom he could form a team where they would both walk in lockstep just like his mother and father. Now that he had finally found a woman who, despite being so far ahead, was willing to wait for him so that they would both walk at the same pace and rhythm, what more could Xietain ask for as a man? Xietain did not know who was the most beautiful woman in the universe, but it was hard for him to imagine anyone more beautiful than Lilith. She was talented, powerful, beautiful, with a great status in the universe. And yet, she was willing to sit on the ground and paint wood without putting on any airs at all. In this kind of era, finding such a woman was harder than throwing a stone into the sky and hitting the gods. Let's call it a day. It's time to stop Callie. That girl doesn't even pay attention to anyone when she's working. Are you the one to say that? Anyway, we're having dinner at my place today. Bai Sherlin used her left hand to rub her eyes with a sleepy expression while with her small right hand she took the hand of Lilith in her lily form. Bai Zemin touched Callie's shoulder but said nothing as he knew she wouldn't understand anyway. The girl jumped slightly in fright before quickly calming down after remembering what was going on. However, when she turned to look at Bai Zemin her expression wasn't very good and she even said some words that he naturally didn't understand at all. Having no response, Callie snorted and picked up the small unadorned earring before casually pricking her right ear. Bai Zemin, since you don't understand the language of Eventide world, let me tell you using words you will surely understand. Bai Zemin's eyes widened slightly and a flash of surprise shone in his pupils as he looked at the girl sitting in the wheelchair. I don't like to be interrupted when I'm working. Bai Zemin turned a deaf ear to the complaint of the little porcelain doll in front of him and instead asked in surprise. Callie, you. Is that Chinese? Humph. If it is not Chinese, then what else? Callie snorted, still in a bad mood. Considering that she was usually indifferent to the whole world, the fact that she started to show so many emotional reactions when she was with Bai Zemin was a big breakthrough, even if those emotions were not positive as in this case. But didn't you say it would take you 2 or 3 days to finish it? Bai Zemin asked, puzzled. I said it would take that long to finish inscribing all the runes. I never said it would take me 2 or 3 days to draw runes to understand your language. Callie grumbled before making a shooing gesture with her hand as she slowly said, you can go on with your business while I go on with mine. Bai Zemin's expression changed when he heard this, and before Callie could take the chisel back to work he directly lifted her out of her wheelchair. You. What are you doing? Callie asked in a serious voice as Bai Zemin placed her on his back, forcing her to wrap her arms around his neck in order not to fall. Powder, it is dinner time. Bai Zemin said as he stored Callie's wheelchair in his space storage ring. Callie felt him begin to move, and realizing she had no say in the matter, Callie gave up as she sighed. In that case, after dinner. After dinner it will be sleep time. At a loss for words, Callie relaxed onto his back and let herself be carried as she said softly, shameless. Lilith chuckled as she followed Bai Zemin closely when she suddenly heard the small whisper of Bai Sherlin, walking hand in hand with her. How envious. Lilith blinked in surprise before looking at the little girl who was looking at Callie's back grimly. My little Sherlin wants to be carried too, eh? Bai Sherlin suddenly looked at Lilith in surprise and blushed slightly as she shook her head hurriedly. And no. Sherlin is a big girl after all. Pfft. Lilith almost burst out laughing at the sight of Bai Sherlin getting anxious. The girl cried out in surprise as she suddenly found herself being lifted by Lilith, and before she could protest Bai Sherlin was being carried just like Callie. Lilith mommy, put me down. Sherlin is a big girl now. Bai Sherlin began to squirm with a face as red as an apple. If it wasn't because Lilith was not an ordinary person as everyone thought she would have been crushed by Bai Sherlin who was unknowingly using too much strength. Nope, Lilith giggled softly in response. Bai Sherlin's struggles gradually became weaker, and a minute or two later the girl finally seemed to have surrendered to her fate. Just like Callie, she wrapped her arms gently around Lilith's neck and let her head rest on her shoulder. Bai Zemin looked over his shoulder and chuckled when he saw Lilith winking at him. He shook his head and looked forward again with a much lighter mood than before. Really? If only I could live the rest of my life this way, I'd have no complaints. Bai Zemin sighed in his heart. Bai Zemin knew that it was not enough to be the strongest in China or on Earth. Who could assure him that tomorrow someone far more powerful would not appear and destroy all the peace and happiness he cherished? It was ironic that in order to live in peace and be happy in life, people were forced to fight and be in constant conflict. But only the strongest could truly live in peace. Only the strongest could afford to sleep without worrying about tomorrow. Therefore, he had to continue fighting until the day when he gets to that point. Chapter 930 Unforgettable Night Surrounded by Beauties, Part 1. Before going home, Bai Zemin made a stop at the villa of the Wu family and for the first time met Wu Jianhong, the former premier of China. Honestly, Bai Zemin's impression of Wu Jianhong was far from good after learning that he did nothing to prevent Xianyuan Wentian from launching nuclear missiles against the faction of which his granddaughter and son were a part, and this was probably noticeable on his face as the old man smiled bitterly as he sat on the couch in front of him without saying a word. Bai Zemin was waiting for Wu Yijuan, who was taking a shower according to what Sun Ling had informed him. Sun Ling had been paying attention to Lilith in her lily form and had done nothing to hide her analytical eyes. Strangely, Sun Ling couldn't help but feel puzzled as she looked at the woman in front of her. Although this woman had a normal appearance at best, her body was certainly that of a demon. However, what made Sun Ling more alert was that she did not know the reason why she felt that this woman in front of her was very beautiful even though she clearly was not. She knew that the stat not trackable charm existed since her class was related to charm and assassination. However, never in her wildest dreams could she imagine that the charm of the seemingly normal woman in front of her was absurdly high. Aunt Sun, Uncle Wu is not at home? Bai Zemin asked in confusion when he did not see Wu Keqian anywhere. Sun Ling slowly turned her attention back to Bai Zemin, and after a moment she replied with a faint smile. Today is Lim Qinyu's turn, so your Uncle Wu probably won't be home. Lim Qinyu? Who's that? Bai Zemin frowned in confusion. Lim Qinyu is his other wife. Do you remember? You saw her once in the past. Yijuan talked to her father and told him that even if she agreed to him having another woman besides me and I was fine with that, she didn't want that woman to live here, so Keqian agreed and prepared a villa for her not far from this one. Sun Ling replied calmly. It was then that the vague image of a beautiful woman appeared blurred in Bai Zemin's memories. He had met this woman once when he and his team arrived at this base, pretending to be normal survivors. Oh. Bai Zemin nodded without asking any more questions about it. This was none of his business anyway, and how others lived their lives was up to them. Sun Ling didn't seem particularly interested in this matter either, as she soon turned her attention back to Lily, and asked curiously, Little Zemin, who is this young lady? She knew Callie as, although they had not exchanged any words, Sun Ling knew that she was the girl who came with Bai Zemin from the other world. However, this was the first time Sun Ling and Lilith in her human form had met. Of course, she had never met Lilith in her real form either. Ah, I'm sorry. Bai Zemin also realized his mistake and quickly introduced them. Aunt Sun, allow me to introduce you. Her name is Lily, she is my fiancée. Your fiancé? Sun Ling was so surprised that her eyes widened as she looked Lily up and down. How did I hear about this just now? This? Bai Zemin scratched his head and said a little embarrassed, actually, other than my family, Bing Shui, and Yijuan, I haven't had much time for these things. Actually, Bai Zemin was also confused. What was he supposed to do? A party to announce to everyone that the girl sitting next to him was his girlfriend, or something similar? Sun Ling said nothing but looked carefully at the beautiful woman who was looking at her with a faint smile. Subconsciously, Sun Ling let out a sigh as if seemingly relieved of something as she extended her hand and said, with genuine kindness, Lily, right? It's nice to meet you. My name is Sun Ling and I'm Yijuan's mom, whom you probably already know, but you can call me Aunt Sun since you're part of the family. Bai Zemin broke into a furious cough as he looked at Wu Yijuan's mother with tears at the edge of his eyes. Aunt Sun, what do you mean by family? What are you talking about? Aren't we one big family from the same faction? You even call me aunt and all. Sun Ling looked at him as if she didn't understand what he was saying, but the slight smile at the corner of her mouth suggested something different. My dear Aunt Sun, don't make things difficult for me, please. Bai Zemin really wanted to plead out loud. Lilith in her human form chuckled and her eyes glistened strangely as she looked at Sun Ling. Wu Yijuan's mother was most likely relieved to discover that she was normal, as Sun Ling was clearly vigilant of Shangguan Bing Shui in comparison. At the end of the day, for all those who did not know the truth, it was certain that Shangguan Bing Shui was undoubtedly the most outstanding woman of all and with whom no other woman could compete, not even Wu Yijuan. Lilith also extended her hand and gave the other party's hand a little squeeze as she said in a soft voice, Zemin mentioned you to me, Aunt Sunday. He said he would like to get to know you in more depth. What? Bai Zemin subconsciously raised his voice as he jumped to his feet. When in hell had he ever said such a thing? Lilith looked at him seemingly confused and said in a puzzled voice, didn't you say before that Aunt Sun's class is probably a special or unique one and that's why you'd like to know more about her limits? Bai Zemin's corner trembled as he slowly returned to his seat. This little minx was clearly poking fun at him. Ha ha ha. Sun Ling suddenly started laughing. Her shoulders shook and it's probably partly due to her class, but her breasts jiggled in such an enticing way that Wu Jianhong coughed several times as he looked away to avoid sinning. She giggled for several seconds before looking at Lilith with a big smile. Lily, I have to say I already like you very much, girl. I hope you and my daughter can be good friends in the future. Oh, Yijuan and I call each other sister. Lilith waved her hand as if she was telling old news. Oh? Sun Ling's eyes sparkled and she leaned forward with a look filled with curiosity. Lily, one of these days I'd like to be able to chat with you about life while showing you my tea leaves. I'll be happy to make you company, Aunt Sunday. Bai Zemin gave up in the face of these two women. Even an idiot would be able to figure out what was going on in this place. And the worst part of it all was that Lilith was definitely enjoying it. Wu Jianhong remained seated in silence. His attention was focused on the young man in front of him who was now chatting with the two little girls, sitting next to him. No one knew what he was thinking. About 10 minutes later, Wu Yijuan came downstairs with slightly damp hair and wearing a cute and comfortable dress suitable to be at home. Bai Zemin. When she saw Bai Zemin in the living room of her house, the girl subconsciously tried to fix her hair a little while straightening her dress with her other hand. Seeing this, Sun Ling chuckled and shook her head as she said in a mocking voice, Girl, could you be more obvious? Mom. Wu Yijuan stomped and puffed out her cheeks as she said blushing, Why didn't you tell me we had guests? It's not good to make guests wait. Well, I didn't invite them but they came. Sun Ling excused herself before pointing at Bai Zemin and slowly saying, Besides, it was this boy who told me to let you take your shower undisturbed. Bai Zemin's eyes lingered for a second on Wu Yijuan's swan-like neck and he could not help but notice a light mist of warm steam surrounding her still slightly flushed skin as proof that she had just stepped out of the bath. She was truly a beautiful woman in every aspect. Face, body, talent, attitude, personality. Wu Yijuan literally had it all and any man would be more than delighted to receive her affection. Even Bai Zemin admitted in his heart that had it not been for Lilith's existence he might have fallen for her. He dismissed those thoughts and stood up with the intention of leaving. You're leaving already? Why don't you stay for dinner? Everyone can, of course. Wu Yijuan immediately proposed while looking at him with soft eyes. She literally hadn't stopped to look at the other people. Bai Zemin smiled gently and said slowly, Actually, the reason I came was because I have an important matter I need to talk to you about in private. Yijuan, are you free tomorrow? I would like you to join me for the afternoon and evening. You want me to accompany you in the afternoon and evening? Wu Yijuan looked at him in surprise. Her heart began to beat harder but she tried to keep calm and asked carefully, We meet at the government building. Usually, when a guy asked a girl if she would like to join him in the evening if she was free, it meant that he was asking her out on a date. However, times had changed, and Wu Yijuan knew that most probably Bai Zemin didn't mean that. Oh, not in the government building. He shook his head, And after glancing sideways at Lilith and seeing that she was simply smiling calmly, he sighed in relief as he said, "Actually, I'd like you to join me for a walk around the base while you update me on everything and we grab a bite to eat, over there. Later on I'd like to take you to a place that so far only Lily and Sherlyn know about." This, Wu Yijun was very surprised. No matter how she looked at it, this wasn't much different from a date. Going out for a walk while they chatted, having a bite to eat at a restaurant, a roadside stand. Besides, he had just said he wanted to show her a place that only Lily and Sherlyn knew about. It was understandable that Lily and Sherlyn had privileges. One was his girlfriend and the other his daughter after all. But what was her place here? Seeing that she did not respond, Xietain quickly said, "Actually, if you are busy, forget it. I'll get B. I'm not busy at all." Wu Yijun interrupted him, not wanting him to continue. Even if it was just an illusion was better than nothing. Xietain looked at her with a complicated expression, and after a moment finally nodded, "In that case, see you tomorrow." Wu Yijun nodded with a serious expression on her face, but only she knew how agitated her heart was inside her chest. Just as Xietain was helping Callie rest on his back, Lilith stood up and took by Sherlyn's hand. She looked at Wu Yijun and said with a faint smile, "Sis Yijun, it turns out that Xietan's mom is cooking a delicious dinner for tonight to celebrate his return home. Would you like to come, eh?" Wu Yijun looked at her in surprise before looking at Xietain, who was as surprised as she was. I'm not really sure." Lilith looked at Xietain with a smile that wasn't a smile and said under her breath, "It's okay, isn't it? I'm sure Mother will be happy to have little sister Yijun joining us." Xietain sighed in his heart. Lilith had literally just cut off any exit route for him with those words. Besides, if his mother Yilinger found out that he refused here, he would definitely be beaten to death. Oh well, what could go wrong at a dinner party? Xietain took comfort in his heart as he nodded. "Sure, if Yijun doesn't mind, then I'd be glad to have her joining us for dinner." Wu Yijun's eyes lit up as if thousands of stars were shining deep in them. She waved her right hand as she turned and ran up the stairs. I'll go change into more suitable clothes. I'll be right back." For some reason, Xietain felt that something was going to happen tonight.